Okay, so we are live with Paul Culmsee here, and we are trying something very new. We are working in Facebook live streaming live, and we are also doing this for the podcast, which will go out on Thursday through the podcasting that you see on Google Play and inside the iTunes Store. And it turns out there's plenty of places where people listen to podcasts these days that is fairly new to a lot of people. So whether you're commuting or whether you're sitting at home and you're just chilling out with a glass of wine, it seems that this is a new way of consuming information. So a big thank you for joining the Facebook Live. I actually got it up on my screen, so if you guys have got any comments, I can see those in my browser as we speak. And I'll do some intros now. So Paul, welcome from Perth in Western Australia.
Thanks, mate.
I appreciate you coming on. I guess we've had a checkered history in terms of working together when I was first over in Western Australia in 2003.
That's right, yes.
And you were at the time the IT pro that was the gatekeeper to anything leaving our developer.
Yeah,
developer coding
I was
hands.
I was the angry system administrator, if I recall, and you were part of a cohort of developers that I saw as a bunch of scary dudes who need to have adult supervision. I think that was probably. And actually, you know what's funny about that, by the way? I'm going to quickly tell you this story. About a year later, I think, when we met again, and at that time you'd gone off into SharePoint consulting. And I remember you threatening physical harm to people that didn't package up their customizations properly into sort of WSPs. And I remember sitting there in the user group thinking, "Oh, Jeremy's into his evil system administrator stage. He's in his angry stage." Yeah, so I'd sort of by then I'd sort of gotten out of the angry stage, and and then but you were right in it. So there you go.
And so for people, I mean, you'd be most well known, I guess, globally for cleverworkarounds.com, I would assume. Is that the way you'd phrase it, or?
I think so. Certainly less so in the last couple of years because blogging is a little bit time-consuming these days. But for a while there, that blog was fairly well known in the SharePoint world.
Yeah, and because you kind of exploded thing into a multi-part series and tried to really explain in plain English, I guess, with all of the frustration levels of where you hit blockers, how things worked and how they didn't work and how they probably should work.
I think that's fair because I figured that this is pre-end user SharePoint, and Mark Miller and the project you guys did, where I felt that a lot of the blogs at the time were written by developers for developers, which was fine, but there was people like me who I'm kind of like, if maybe Reuven, Gotts, Sue Hanley and Todd Clint had a love child, you'd have me. And so basically, therefore, I was looking for a bit more detail, and because I wasn't a developer, I needed a little bit of backgrounder, and I always found that helped my own learning anyway. So yes, I would explode in these giant multi-part kind of blog posts, and probably with a little bit of annoyance. Every frustration, it was embedded in the lines.
I think it helped because it understood like how much effort you went through to get to this final resolution of having it running.
I think so, and hopefully it helped others too.
Oh, definitely.
That'd be the
I've had that feedback, best and I've had people recommend, "Hey, have you heard of this Paul Culmsee guy?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I may have known him." And they're like, "Wait, he's in Perth? I thought he was American." No.
If I was American, I'd be at more conferences. But as you well know, being a former Perth person, it's a damn long way to go.
Yeah, it's brutal.
Podcasts like this are probably the best, my best window to the world at the moment.
It feels even further away now having a kid because my parents live in Perth still, and you've got to come over. I'm like, well, it's not really that easy. It's not kind of a short trip to New York. This is a pretty big time investment to take the 32-hour flight over to Perth.
Yeah, and that's notwithstanding the jet lag. And if I can indulge, how's fatherhood treating you?
It's great. I don't look. Actually, you can't see my video because it's streaming to Facebook. But for people on Facebook, they'll probably comment. I don't look too tired, but I'm the one that's working during the day, and so Julie, my wife, is the one that's kind of taking the night shifts now that I'm back at work. She's brutal. But she's a champ. She's handling it pretty well. But learning
now
all the
that you're a
different
parent,
cries.
can I say one thing?
Go on, you can just scare me. I can't be any more scared.
Okay, so my first child slept through the night at 6 weeks.
Yeah,
so see how you
that's
go.
rubbing
And then
it
when
in.
you're at week 7 and you've gotten a 2 hours sleep, you'll remember that comment and think,
No, what I'll do
curse
is
and
I'll
swear.
ring you when it's 3 a.m. in the morning and wake you up to remind you that I'm awake because my baby's kept me awake.
Yeah, which is probably a really convenient time for me being on the other side of the planet. But
Actually, I'll have to work
we'll
out.
do another podcast.
Yeah, that's right. Just jump in there. So you've been kind of evolved in terms of moving from SharePoint, and you did a fair amount of book writing actually, with some interesting takes on that. Like I read your first Heretics Guide, which again had your very conversational flow and discussion, and absorbed that really well. How would you describe like the work you do there and how that would benefit people that are in the Office 365 IT space looking to improve productivity of their orgs? Like, what would people get out of that book and the subsequent book that you've written around that kind of mapping process?
That's a really good question. Probably a much improved. Well, you become a better, I guess, BA. That's maybe a crude way of putting it. You definitely become a better business analyst. You'd understand more empathy for the customer, more empathy for the client, I think, and a better appreciation of the nature of the problem that you're actually dealing with, maybe, and then how to handle it. Because a lot of SharePoint, and I'm seeing it in Office 365 because of the digital transformation connotations that come from going cloud. It's really a big change management exercise. You're asking people to change behaviors, and they don't necessarily see that there's a problem with the existing behaviors. And so if you take the sort of project management or delivery approach that will get your email system put in or convert, say, a phone system to VoIP, that isn't just not going to work when you're putting in, say, a collaboration platform like SharePoint Office 365.
And it's a big thing that we hear is like this, you go from SharePoint being on-prem, where SharePoint is a big bag of things it can do and could do. As it's evolved into 2016, there's definitely a focus on reducing the functionality to be more focused in certain areas. But as soon as you hop over into Office 365 and turn that switch on, you're really opening like a lot of stuff. Like you're really kind of pushing, I guess, this notion of not just email and documents, but then conversations, whether you do them in email or Yammer or Teams, and then obviously some of these new additional things with PowerApps and all these other services like Microsoft Forms for surveying that's just came on board. So is that kind of the sense making that you talk about is around that notion?
Yeah, well, that's a classic example, right? I mean, it's called sense making because it literally is helping people make sense of a complex situation.
Yeah.
And so if you imagine, if you've had 25 years of on-premises IT, and these sort of monolithic applications, they're quite distinct. You have your email, you have your SharePoint, you have your various bits, and suddenly that's all gone, and what it's replaced with is a whole bunch of services that you can consume in whatever way, shape or form that may be. Notwithstanding that, because of, I guess, the nature of how Microsoft works, you'd know this better than me, that there's a lot of overlap between these solutions, and even sometimes something new gets announced, and so if you think from the poor old fatigued client perspective, they're like, what's that one? I thought we just figured out how this works now, and there's this new product here. How's that going to work? And then they know that inevitably users will ask for it, and then they have to deal with that. So that's an example of complexity. It's cognitively complex because there's a lot to take in. It's also socially complex because you've got different cohorts that want to use different tools. And then if you say, no, let's just turn all this off until we figure it out, then you're in an environment, this is a true story, where I had one client that turned off some of the new things, like they turned off Teams. And so suddenly the part of the business that wanted Teams ended up going to Slack. And so now it's a worse scenario because they've got the same functionality, but they don't have the IT oversight that they saw as a blocker. But from a information management and risk point of view, you're in a worse situation than had you have given them a Teams deployment without, even if you haven't fully figured out how you're going to manage it, would that be better than running off to something that is outside of your sphere of control? So, and same, I saw it with Planner as well. Planner got turned off, and guess what? Trello got spun up. So So yeah, it's a very different era these days, and so that's a classic example of where sense making is required, because it's not just going, should we choose this tool over this? It's literally how are our groups of users behaving? How's the business evolving? What circumstances does it find itself in? And what should we do about that?
And so you go in and do these consultancy gigs over in Perth and walk through that with them and get them to understand the process so they can carry on doing it on their own behalf?
Pretty much, it's capability building. I think there's massive change coming, because we were just talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I stopped blogging is the pace of change got too beyond why build a 6-part epic series when by the time you finish it 20% of it is redundant because of a change that's been made. And so the way you approach training now, I think, has to change, because there's just too much there. And if you, for example, were taught PowerApps, is a good example, I think, where here's all the different features of PowerApps, I don't think you're actually going to have a great outcome. I think you need to start with a use case, and almost it's evolving into hackathon style training, whereas I've got this idea for an app, here's a need that I want to satisfy, and so the trainer basically helps you use these different tools and leverage their various strengths to come up with a solution. And I think you learn that way. I think that's the future.
And so is that how you got into PowerApps? You had a customer discussion where they had a need and you'd been kind of keeping up on the PowerApps news, realizing that kind of InfoPath and the SharePoint Designer way of doing those sort of things went away, and figured you'd use this as a kind of a good justification whether PowerApps was a good fit?
Actually, it was almost that, but it was slightly different. So, you know how a lot of companies are getting into the whole lean MVP thing?
Yeah.
And I don't mean MVP as in the Microsoft MVP, as in minimum viable product.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of companies, that's really gone into the kind of corporate vernacular, but most people misunderstand MVP, and believe me, I'm speaking from experience here. MVP is really, if you've got a hypothesis or an idea, what's the minimum you can do to prove that idea is correct? And so I had an issue. The issue was that we were doing a knowledge management kind of lessons learnt system for a client, and I had a hypothesis that using people would capture lessons more readily with a mobile phone than they would filling in a giant lessons learnt form, because people have been trying to do that forever. And so the idea of whip out the phone, take a photo of something, quickly log your insight. Insight at the point of inspiration. Think about it that way, instead of coming back a week later when it's all sort of faded. So it was a hypothesis. And so then I said, well, what's the quickest way I can test this hypothesis? Because I don't want to go and write a mobile app. And so I thought it's about time I had to go at PowerApps. And so I ended up doing a basic PowerApps, just using a SharePoint list, the whole wizard kind of experience that some listeners will have tried. And that was actually quite effective. And so it was a bit like bringing back some long dormant InfoPath memories, because I did quite a lot of InfoPath years ago. And from there, so I was able to really quickly prove the hypothesis, because the beauty of PowerApps, of course, is you can build this app and then you can share it so quickly to sections of your organization. So we had a reference team with this project of about 30 people around the world. I shared this app with them. I said to them, just go to your app store, download PowerApps, sign in with your company account, you'll have this app there. And so they were actually capturing data for me. And so I was able to actually test my core proposition, which was proven. So by the way, lessons are best captured when they're mobile applications. And from there, then it enabled us to iterate really quickly, because so we tested some other bits and pieces. We wanted to test taking photos and stuff. And so pretty much every challenge I was given, I found ways of being able to address. And that really, for me, I'm not a developer. I'm not a professional developer. I might dabble around with a bit of PowerShell and some other stuff, but like I said earlier, I'm more of an IT pro. But I was able to pretty much do everything that I wanted to test without having to call in the developers and go to that great expense. And so that was really, for me, I thought, ooh, this product is really, really interesting. As far as rapidly testing ideas and rapidly prototyping things, it looks really good. Over the last 9-10 months or so, since I think it was about maybe as early as a year, maybe 9 months ago, but over that time, it's gotten a lot more feature-rich and a lot more stable. And so not only is it a very good prototyping tool, it's rapidly becoming a fantastic citizen developer tool. And I hope that term makes sense to people. And I think it's probably, if I project my mind another year or two, I think it's going to become a very useful tool for enterprise mobile applications.
And so, where do you think the value in that's come through versus something like InfoPath? Like, there's always traps of comparing products, but I think for people that listen to this who've come from the SharePoint world, they will want to know what the comparison is with InfoPath. But how do you tackle that in your head? Like, as someone who's done a lot of InfoPath and known some of those limitations, how do you find then that PowerApps is kind of a different team, it's a different product, it's got a slightly different skew on things, and it seems like they've tackled this prototyping thing a lot better, because you mentioned the mobile thing. But do you get the comparisons with InfoPath when you're talking to your customers, or are people quite willing to start fresh with those things?
Oh, well, I reckon it's inevitable that it'll be compared to InfoPath, because everyone's coming from a SharePoint-oriented perspective, and that was the Forms tool. So, any suggestion otherwise doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But I suppose, I think PowerApps represents a broader pattern that I've been seeing happening for a while, and I'll be interested in your take on this. SharePoint was such a monolithic tool where it had everything. It had workflow, right? It had forms. It had all of those bits all together. And so Microsoft, as soon as SharePoint Online or Office 365 happened, Microsoft have actually been breaking those pieces of functionality apart again and just loosely coupling them all via web services. Now, I think that's fantastic, because that suddenly means each of these pieces of functionality that might have, like workflow, SharePoint Designer Workflow was not a particularly great product, and you had to use third-party tools once you went beyond trivial scenarios. Now that something like Flow, which is a key piece of all of this puzzle, is now a standalone product, it tightly integrates with SharePoint, but you can also use it with a whole bunch of other services.
Right.
So that creates incredible flexibility, and as I said, I think the era of the citizen developer is now upon us, because using these fit for purpose tools, they're no longer trying to do everything. They do one thing really well, and then they talk to other services, and I think that's a nice scalable model that increases or less limitations than what, say, InfoPath had, and less limitations on what SharePoint Designer Workflows had. All the while, anyone that knew InfoPath and knew SharePoint Designer Workflows are able to transition quite well to PowerApps and Flow type of paradigm.
And so do you find that, hypothetically, in a different universe, if InfoPath still existed, the solutions that you're building now, would you be able to do them? Or is it because this notion of the fact that it's very mobile centric, and maybe InfoPath might have gotten there, but more so you say the connecting to the systems, that's really made a difference to people in terms of how they look at PowerApps versus how they may have looked at InfoPath 2017?
I think both are powerful. So I mentioned earlier, I've been doing sort of hackathon style training on PowerApps, and so the two biggest things that people have responded to, so people have gone into the room, typical training, you need to go on this training, so people come in not quite knowing what to expect. But pretty soon, as soon as they see they run the PowerApp application on the phone, and they can now see their application on the phone, that's a big aha moment for people, because suddenly they're like, oh my goodness, there are so many little trivial processes that we could just, paper things, checklists, audits, inspections, things like that could just go. And then the minute, once they're in that environment, suddenly you show that you can also, while you're there, you can connect to SQL, or you can connect to Salesforce, or Instagram, or Dropbox, or any of these other things. And by the way, if you want to actually control the process in more detail, you can use this thing called Flow to send emails, or to send approvals and things like that around. That is very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And so I think people suddenly they realize that there's all of these things that previously they would have had to get others to do for them, i.e., developers or consultancies. Suddenly they can do a lot of these things themselves. Of course, there are governance implications of that aren't immediately aware of, but it's funny how it doesn't take long. So in these hackathons that I've been doing, after about a day, and people have built out, they're building apps, they're using Flow, they're using PowerApps, so this stuff is not hard to learn. I'm teaching people who are not IT people. You call them maybe hobbyists. They might dabble, so they're kind of, bit tech savvy, but they're by no means developers. They are able to do some reasonably sophisticated PowerApps things pretty quick with Flow. They suddenly sort of had this realization about, start of day 2, like, oh, there's going to be a lot of these applications. How are we going to manage this? Like, what happens if so-and-so leaves? And so suddenly the governance question almost starts to be, owned by those who are actually building and maintaining these solutions, and I think that's a good thing. So instead of being a sort of monolithic centralized governance, it's almost a decentralized model as well. But anyway, that's kind of that's the pattern I've seen so far in the training I have been doing with clients.
And then the other aspects of that is there is this notion that it wasn't really a SharePoint first way of the world, because this is built by a different team inside of Microsoft, but they had these connectors to SharePoint, and it seems that they've kind of rapidly sidestepped to incorporate and kind of embrace the SharePoint guys, because they've realized that there's so much usage out there in the SharePoint world from the InfoPath team. But
oh yeah, and actually, you know something, if they don't do that, then what a humongous missed opportunity that is.
Right.
You know, there's decade or more of lived earned experience on those sort of information management practices and what people used and how they used it. If they didn't do that, that would just be sort of beyond belief to me. I'll assume, well, the fact that the connectivity is there leads me to believe that there's collaboration going on, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
And I really like what it can do now. And I have to say, I love, because I know you're involved in this, Azure Functions is probably the bit of magic that for someone who, and again, I'm not a developer, right?
Yeah.
But the minute Flow can't do something, Azure Functions picks up where Flow is sort of a limitation. So I've been able to do all sorts of things in PowerApps that I never imagined, I would have been able to as a non-developer. And that stuff's fantastic. So yeah, kudos to you for making that one happen.
Yeah, well, it wasn't. I mean, I was just there making the noise to announce it. There was a very, very smart team that's still there, and I must admit, I was.
I'm sure it was all you, Jeremy.
Oh, totally. I'll claim it. I must admit, I just went in there the other day because I do a SharePoint plus Azure Functions session at a lot of conferences, and they've just continued to keep evolving that UI and making it really streamlined for, I mean, the pro developer, but also for kind of citizen developers that want to write Azure Functions as well. I think it's very approachable as well.
The best thing is the PowerShell support. So because I'm a huge fan of Vesa Juvonen.
Yeah.
And I've been cyber stalking that dude for years.
I think unfortunately for Vesa, there's lots of stalkers out there.
Yeah, so way before, he had a blog where he was talking about sort of remote provisioning practices and stuff, and that sort of morphed into PNP. So for those of you that aren't aware, if you're doing anything with SharePoint Online and you're not using the PNP PowerShell stuff, you are missing out on tremendous functionality. And so I was able to take from an idea from John Liu, I put the PowerShell PNP stuff up as an Azure function. And so that means you can do things like you can have PowerApps to provision new sites. So it could be a site request form for a client. It can be uploading photos. It can be doing more sophisticated things. So you might have a Power App where you press a button, and actually what it does, it goes and updates a SharePoint list. Then it goes and uploads a bunch of photos to some libraries. Then it does the lookups, so it refers back to the lists, updates some metadata, does various bits and pieces, and plus if there's a problem, it has rollback and cleans itself up again. And so that's the sort of thing that Azure Functions gives you the ability to do. So I was like Homer Simpson in the land of chocolate when I discovered I could do that. And it's been very useful.
In the back in the day, I'm pretty sure you've written the blog post as well, and I don't know who originally wrote the 80-20 rule with InfoPath, which was really around this notion of InfoPath was a great prototyping tool. It got you to a certain point where you could really kind of tease that business unit on exactly what you wanted to do. But once you wanted to get to kind of going into production, they went, well, we just got these other 2 or 3 different things that we needed to do. And you'd be like, no problem. And then you go back to your desk and you try to build them, and you just like run into a wall. And then you have to go back to the customer and go, well, we've hit the limitations of InfoPath, but I can charge you another 40 grand and we can build this thing as a custom .NET solution for you. And well, hang on, but we wanted it in InfoPath so we could change it in the future. Do you find, because of the fact that there is this flow support and the kind of extension to Azure Functions, that this makes that scenario a bit easier for you, and you feel more confident because you go into a customer, you do the prototyping in PowerApps, and you know that you have some kind of wiggle room and almost some outs to jump over to other things to keep the realism of what they asked for there?
I reckon very good question, and the answer to that is it's actually probably you're at the right time in the mindset of management to do this. And what I mean by that is, we live in an era where everyone's got this giant thing for lean startup. And so whether that is even a good management paradigm or not, I won't just, you can read that in my second book. But it means that things like you got to iterate, you got to have MVP, right? You got to, you don't do these big, huge 6-month projects to only find out you're solving the wrong problem. So that is now, a lot of big corporates are taking this idea of MVP and sort of looking enviously to the startup world and saying, yeah, we should be doing that too. And so, and of course, the whole idea of agile fits in there. So set against that paradigm, using PowerApps is just a complete no-brainer because you can produce an app in a day. And with the Azure Functions and Flow, you can probably produce a much more sophisticated app than what you could ever do with InfoPath and Designer Workflows. And at that point, you may actually find that you can go a lot further. The way I'd characterize it is, you're still right. There's the 80-20 rule, but maybe it's the 90-10 now because you can go significantly further than you ever could with InfoPath, just because of the fact that they've, Flow is a dedicated product with its own capabilities, as is PowerApps. Both of them talk nicely to SharePoint, and even where there is a limitation, so at present, for example, you can't upload a photo from PowerApps to SharePoint straight away, but using Flow you can, and if you want to do a really sophisticated scenario using Azure Functions, you can. So I think that it's exactly the same paradigm, if not more significant now, in the whole, this is how you're going to get MVP, fantastic. You get it out into the hands of your users so much more easily because you can just share it and off they go and use it. I also note that the new capability hasn't dropped yet, and I'm not privy to it, but I've seen how PowerApps is going to be integrated into the SharePoint experience. I've certainly embedded it into MS Teams, so using it in team spaces. So it's not just a mobile play. You can really embed this thing into so many different scenarios. So there's a lot to like about it.
And so the scenario that you had with the multiple photos, was that a real world business case? Because I saw you and John, who's in Melbourne or Sydney, I can't remember.
Yep.
And I saw
Sydney, I think he is.
I think that's the beauty of kind of social. When we first started blogging all the way back in like 06, 07, there was no real Facebook and Twitter to kind of have those debates and see them kind of in real time. So people will post and some people will comment. But now it's almost like I could see you guys bouncing off and challenging each other, and kind of like John was like, I've done it. And then you would come back like literally a few hours later and go, but I've done it better. And so what was that you were trying to achieve with PowerApps, and what wasn't there out of the box that you had to extend?
So basically what happened there was John had written a blog post that proved that you could use Flow to basically take a photo. Actually, no, he did. Yeah, that's right. Back up a bit. Gee, my memory's dodgy. Originally, he was the one that used Azure Functions to write PowerShell code to take photos, but he had a problem with Azure Functions. He couldn't get something working. So because I knew the P&P stuff quite well, I was able to get that working. So that was my little, look here, here's John, here's how you do it. He then went, actually, I've moved on. I can now do it in Flow. So he then proved that you could take a photo in Flow. But this was all just like single photo stuff. I think he'd written a selfie app. So you imagine holding up PowerApps, take a photo, click submit, and off it goes into SharePoint. My need was a bit different. If you think most real-world scenarios would never be an individual photo, anytime you're going to do something, so for example, an inspection. Let's say you're doing an inspection of a piece of equipment on a site. You're probably going to take a whole bunch of photos. And even if you're doing a lessons learned, or just say it was, I found a better way to calibrate this particular piece of equipment, you're going to take before shots, you're going to take after shots. So there's always going to be multiple photos. So the challenge there was the methods they'd come up with would only work for a single photo, and so I was able to do a multi-photo scenario using Azure Functions. And when I did it, I wanted to package up the photos so it was just one transaction sending back from PowerApps to SharePoint. Because if you imagine sending a whole bunch of photos and then your internet drops and you've only sent just a certain number of them. So I did that, and then it was actually Michael Svensson from Norway who then he took what I'd done and he improved upon it. I say through gritted teeth, he did a better job, damn it. So he came up with a really good method, and actually his method was still a single photo method. So I sort of went, well, I'll challenge you to handle multiple photos. And so he came back a day later and he had a really good solution for multiple photos. So that's now we can do it all in Flow, and it works really well. And that's the pattern I've been showing in these hackathons for these guys to be able to create their own sort of apps for inspections and audits and checks and balances and things like that.
And so have you had the thing yet where people don't want to store in SharePoint because they see now that PowerApps can kind of go to other sources as well? Or are people quite comfortable with dropping things in SharePoint? Like, I know that scenario you used there, it does kind of make sense because of the photos and being able to have that image library. But it just interests me now that, the box isn't just SharePoint, it's everything, whether customers are kind of changing their thought patterns on whether SharePoint is the right place to kind of constantly drop things.
Well, actually, I reckon most SharePoint people change their thought patterns on whether you should drop things in a SharePoint. But no, true story. As soon as I did the lessons learned, my very first scenario, the lessons learned one, which was sort of lesson capture. As soon as I'd done the first iteration and it worked, I switched to SQL. So we built the everything in SQL, and I redid it as a SQL-based PowerApps. So I'm living proof of that kind of pattern. And the nice thing about PowerApps is if you construct it properly, you can support that. The idea of having multiple data sources was something InfoPath could do, but it wasn't that great. This thing, you can, for example, you click a submit button, it can go and post off your core data to SQL. It could then shoot your binary, your blob data, your photos either into, say, SharePoint or Azure Blob Storage or somewhere like that. And then you could do another transaction that updates the original record with the location of the images, the URLs of the images and stuff.
Yeah.
So a single app can handle multiple data sources quite easily.
And so,
oops, forgot to turn off my mobile.
There you go. Actually,
sorry.
Desperately looking at my one.
Yeah, no, that was me. Sorry.
And so, what were the main reasons to switch from SharePoint to SQL? Was it the fear of that list getting enormous and hitting the scaling limits, or what was some of the decision points there?
It was actually this. Remember, this was in a minimum viable product scenario.
Yeah.
So we had quite an elaborate lessons learnt system. We were developing a knowledge management based system, and this was one lesson capture was one aspect of the system. Mm-hmm. So again, coming back to Lean Startup, we had a hypothesis that using a mobile to capture lessons would be much better than sort of a desktop app in certain scenarios. So we had to test that hypothesis. To test that hypothesis, we didn't need SQL at that point. I could craft up a list to capture some of the basic info I needed, and then distribute an app and actually get real-world user feedback on how well that worked and what the good and bad parts were. Once we had proved that hypothesis, it then became time to actually put it a bit more seriously into the actual solution we were developing, which means, therefore, I had to have this thing right back to the SQL system as opposed to SharePoint.
Okay, so it kind of made sense to, in the first instance, use SharePoint because it was a data source that you could spin up pretty quickly as a prototype. But the nice part about it was that then PowerApps could point to a more robust storage system that integrated with the rest of the systems you're working on.
Spot on.
It's actually a nice way to think about it too, as as you build mobile applications on top of existing systems, you could just do that in PowerApps and leave the rest where it is running as a website somewhere or clunky WinForms.
Yep. Yep. No, that's exactly how we approached it, and I've also found that where SharePoint has a great strength, a bit like it's the 80-20 thing again. You can give someone their own site, mm-hmm. and it doesn't take. You can almost teach someone kind of database thinking by having them build lists and build columns, and then update their PowerApps to represent, as they understand their problem better. They're building these forms, and so you're getting a lot of learning there. And so that is much easier to do in SharePoint land, where you can go and tweak your list and then actually learning SQL scripts and starting to modify relational database structures.
Right.
So I find that starting there with your users, with the view, the clear expectation that eventually this would move into a database type scenario. Once you've sort of figured out exactly what you need and you've gone through a few iterations, that for me makes a lot of sense, and it's completely in line with this iterative approach to problem solving. And not trying to boil the ocean.
And then the other aspect you talked about was this notion of integrating with App Insights in Azure. What was the
Yep.
what did you do there? Like, how did you integrate App Insights into the whole Power Apps aspect?
This was less about the Power Apps actually, but this is just and we should probably talk a little bit about, just learnings from going 100% cloud. So no, what happened here was I had a client who had some dodgy branding done. Isn't that a uncommon scenario? And what happened was this branding, it was taking, of course, on SharePoint Online, and there's higher latency, right? Because you're not serving it from a local server on your network. It's coming across the internet through your proxies and your gateways and all of that sort of stuff. And this particular branding was doing 50, 60 transactions between browser and server, and it was horrible. And so we did a new branding that was much more aligned with all Microsoft's recommendations at that time. But Azure App Insights, if people aren't aware of it, it's fantastic. It's everything in Azure can be monitored to quite a detailed level. And ASP, just web applications in general, they have a little piece of JavaScript they supply. And if you have that JavaScript on a page, it reports everything about how long that page took to load every time it's accessed. So if you picture now, every single time someone loads a SharePoint site or loads your application, it's reporting how long the browser processed the payload, how long the latency took to send the data, how long the server took to process its bits, and it breaks all that down for you. And then you can even do filters by physical location based on IP address ranges. You can filter by device. So you could say, for example, hey, how are all the Apple devices, how are they performing in terms of page load? What about this browser? What about that browser? And so App Insights enabled us to do that. And so what we did was, using some of the patterns and practices stuff, actually, we used the JavaScript, they don't like the word injection, but the JavaScript injection pattern to put this little Azure App Insights thing in. And so we had incredible analytics on how things were performing, and we knew if it was comms, we knew if it was the local PC or the environment that was causing issues, because we had that ability now to understand performance. So that's that was the App Insights thing, and that was related to dealing with the new paradigm of reducing latency, which meant you had to reduce the number of transactions between browser and server.
Yeah, and I guess that isn't just a problem where you are in Perth, and I guess we might have to establish the fact that Perth isn't some tidbit running off one little satellite with 10 people living there. I think the current population is over 2 million, 2.5 million.
Yeah, it's about 2 million.
Yeah.
2.3 or something like that.
I haven't been back since that new bunch of skyscrapers came in at the port, but I'm hoping to get back this Christmas to check that out.
Oh, well, we'll have to go and have a beer.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a plan.
As well.
And so what the other aspect of this, how much of it PowerApps being something that's really kind of cloud driven, how much of that is a stopper, maybe in the customers you talk to, but what you hear more further afield as well? Because obviously Perth has certain industry verticals that kind of have poor quality internet, or they're very remote, or in some cases it might be offline. Is that a problem that kind of is a bit of a hurdle with PowerApps?
The short answer is yes. There'll be people in the PowerApps team probably listening going, no, there's not. So PowerApps does have the ability to do offline support. So it is possible if that you can basically have PowerApps go, ooh, the internet's not there, I'm going to save this to local cache. And so next time you start PowerApps, it's able to then load it up again and say, now would you like to send this? So I have done that, and that works.
Wow,
so,
okay.
Now, it's not as comprehensive as it probably needs to be for industrial strength scenarios at this point, but they're doing a lot of work on that. So and this is the nice thing about the new sort of cloud paradigm. Instead of waiting 3 years for a big bang release, you've got reasonable visibility onto what they're working on. So that's a really good thing. So I expect that'll improve.
Yeah.
I've been actually quite lucky, and probably lucky in an unusual way, that I'm dealing with a scenario that isn't probably the typical one. So my client, who I've been working with for a while now, it's an organization of 22,000 plus people around the world, but they didn't exist 2 years ago. They were literally created out of thin air. It was sort of a demerger of companies, and so a bunch of enterprise architects got to do what enterprise architects do and drew all sorts of sexy whiteboard diagrams, and basically almost constructed, they got to do that. It was greenfields. There was no legacy. No existing on-premises infrastructure to deal with. So I've been living the online dream, if you like, for the last couple of years of 100% online, not constrained by legacy. Now, Getting back to another thing you asked, if you have on-prem infrastructure and you want to use PowerApps, there is a data gateway for some of this stuff, so you can actually have it talk to data sources locally. I have not used it yet because, as I said, I've been working with this very large client that doesn't have any of this sort of restriction or not encumbered in that way. So it's really been an interesting ringside seat into, I think, what a lot of other organisations are going to go through over the next, 1 to 4 years, as they go through this hybrid to cloud stage. And it's been also, it doesn't mean just because they're 100% cloud and they don't have that level of complexity to deal with in terms of hybrid. That does not mean that it has been an easy journey. I mean, the pace of change of this stuff is just completely relentless, and that's probably the biggest thing to deal with. But there's been a whole lot of other, just the mindset changes in getting used to the idea of having your some of your functionality sitting off in, say, an Azure function somewhere. Just the shift in where your risks are. Risks don't go away; they just shift. So it's been quite interesting to see that. So that's kind of the best answer I can give you, Jeremy. It's at the moment my clients who are on-prem are strictly on-prem, and they're still planning to sort of go online, and they're moving workloads like email on. But I have this one very large client that's gone 100% all in with this sort of stuff, and that's where a lot of my learnings have come from.
And again, one last question, because you did bring this up near the beginning, and there's a lot of interest in this with the audience based on the downloads of the podcasts, other than kind of the forms process, is around Microsoft Teams. And you mentioned that you'd pin this into tabs in Teams. How are you seeing the customers you talk to switch on, light up Teams? What are some of the use cases they're kind of bringing on board to take advantage of it inside of their environments?
So I really like Teams. I think Teams has had some really good user-centric design in it. I do like it. Now, Teams is absolutely born for communities of practice for me. And it's also quite useful for, I'm not a huge Yammer user, so I'm probably not informed enough to say when to use Yammer and when to use other stuff. I know that there's a scale thing, but for Teams are fantastic for distributed communities of practice because it has it's got the discussion capability. Then you can integrate a whole lot of other services using the extensibility of Teams. So I've been using Microsoft Stream a lot within Team spaces because, again, community of practice, a lot of stuff it's video, right? You capture rich media, so stick it in Stream, embed it in context via Teams. As I mentioned before, PowerApps really works well in that scenario, and Planner as well. So I think absolutely, if it's a no-brainer for a community of practice, I would, if I was advising clients and they were looking at coming up with sort of a site design for communities, I would just basically say I would recommend you have a good hard look at Teams and see if that can do it for you. Funnily enough, I'm not so convinced, at least at this point, that it's the solution for developers. I think anyone that's come from Slack will probably still stay with Slack for a while because there's a few things that I think Teams needs to do. I think it's also really good for project teams. I've used it with partners of ours where Planner inside Teams got a bit to go, but actually has a lot of potential. But yeah, what else? Pretty much anything where it's conversation-oriented collaboration is what I'd put it. So if you had to choose between going, say, traditional SharePoint team sites or using Microsoft Teams, I'd say to you, is it more important? Is the conversation really what drives the collaboration, or is it the document that drives the collaboration? Right. And if it's the former, then I'd probably lean towards Teams, or at least be having a look at that.
Yeah, I think once they get that external user support, which it looks like has been delayed based on watching the user voice this morning, that eventually that'll be really smart to be able to, not have to add them to your Azure AD to kind of get that experience with external partners.
A lot of my clients are, for example, they do large civil infrastructure projects like build a bridge or upgrade railways or things like that. Right. Now, that's usually a collaboration between multiple parties. These contracts are in the billions of dollars, so there'd be, say, 6 different organizations forming a consortium together. Mm-hmm. Now, you imagine how complex it is to decide whose IT and whose VPN works and all of that. This thing is born for these sort of technologies, and that external federation support is going to be huge for those type of scenarios.
Yeah, that's cool. And so, look, we're wrapping up on nearly 40 minutes, so I wanted to kind of make sure that people can finish listening and get to work if they're listening in the car or on the train, or maybe they've got a nice long plane ride to Australia. How can people get in contact with you? Where's the best place to go to read more and listen more to what you've got to say around this stuff?
Okay, so my blog, Jeremy mentioned originally, is called cleverworkarounds.com.
Yeah.
That's where I am starting to write again. I'm doing the odd bit of PowerApps content at the moment, so that's where I write there. I also have an account on Medium where I write about a lot of my strategy and sense-making work. You alluded to that earlier, the stuff that my books are about.
Yeah.
Then there's the 2 books. One's called The Heretic's Guide to Best Practices. One's called The Heretic's Guide to Management. And otherwise, it's all the usual channels. LinkedIn is good. I'm pretty active on Facebook. I find Facebook actually my best support mechanism for SharePoint questions these days because of the community I've got available. So yeah, you should be able to find me pretty quickly.
Cool, that's awesome. Look, I appreciate you coming on, Paul. I'll definitely have you kind of round robin in a few months, and we'll talk a bit more about what else you've done in PowerApps and some of the lessons you've learned. And I think the nice thing about where you're coming from is very business orientated, which I think a lot of the listeners here will, get a lot out of. So big thank you for sharing that today.
No worries, you're welcome, mate.
And have a good rest of the day as my day starts to wrap up a little bit.
Yeah, go and deal with the baby.
Yeah, that's right. They have to put on
the baby to sleep.
The dad hat and try and get her to sleep at 1 o'clock in the morning.
All right, no problem.
Cool. Cheers, mate. Appreciate your time.
Okay. All right, see you later.